Easy Explain the Collective Unconscious by Carl Jung, The Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious, an essay from 1928. Here we're going to consider just about the first half of it. So that's starting off in part one, see the title there. Moving into section one, see the title there. And we're just going to sum up section one with this passage from Jung towards the end of that section. He says, in view of these facts, we must assume that the unconscious contains not only personal, but also impersonal collective components in the form of inherited categories or archetypes. I have therefore advanced the hypothesis that at its deeper levels, the unconscious possesses collective contents in a relatively active state. That is why I speak of a collective unconscious. So I think this is a good summary, especially connecting back to a lot of what his 1919 essay was on that we covered earlier, previously covered. Kind of just a touch and go here, right? So let's get into section two. He gets a little more topical here. Let's look at what Jung would consider a work of genius to be, or what genius is. So he says, a man is a philosopher of genius only when he succeeds in transmuting the primitive and merely natural vision into an abstract idea belonging to the common stock of consciousness. This achievement and this alone constitutes his personal value, for which he may take credit without necessarily succumbing to inflation, that being ego inflation, right? We are talking about the ego and the unconscious here. So let's not get ahead of ourselves, right? We don't want to inflate our egos. So he's kind of setting out what would be maybe a work of genius that you could inflate your ego on, right? So let's go on. Let's look at how this works both on the inner and outer levels. So here Jung says that outer attractions such as offices, titles, and other social regalia are not the only things that cause inflation, ego inflation. These are simply impersonal quantities that lie outside in society in the collective consciousness. But just as there is a society outside the individual, so there is a collective psyche outside the personal psyche, namely the collective unconscious, concealing, as the above example shows, elements that are no whit less attractive. So here you're starting to use like a metaphor, an analogy, if you will, of how we can point at, in society, there's a collective and there's also us, right, individuals. And Jung is creating this concept to show that the psyche, the mind, it works the same way, right? There's going to be individual and personal components. There's also going to be collective unconscious components. So let's keep going with these analogies. Let's paint the picture with another one. He says, just as the individual is not merely a unique and separate being, but is also a social being, so the human psyche is not a self-contained and wholly individual phenomenon, but also a collective one. And just as certain social functions or instincts are opposed to the interest of single individuals, so the human psyche exhibits certain functions or tendencies which, on account of their collective nature, are opposed to individual needs. So you're saying, right, there's some unconscious and collective things going on inside your being, inside your mind, that are not always going to be for you, but they're part of you. It's just like us being making sacrifices sometimes for the greater good, for the overall benefit of society, right? So Jung's going to also tell us that more of this is going on than we might realize. So he says, all basic instincts and basic forms of thinking and feeling are collective. Everything that all men agree in regarding as universal is collective. Likewise, everything that is universally understood, universally found, universally said and done, all collective. On closer examination, one is always astonished to see how much of our so-called individual psychology is really collective. So much indeed that the individual traits are completely overshadowed by it. Right? This is huge for Jung here, that our minds are more collectively unconscious than we might realize. And we're going to try to figure this out through reflection. Big theme, big act for Jung. He says to find out what is truly individual in ourselves, profound reflection is needed. And suddenly we realize how uncommonly difficult the discovery of individuality is. This is also foreshadowing to Jung's autobiography he wrote very late in his life, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Cool call ahead there. And finally, section three. To kind of wrap up the first half of this essay, let's look at the persona, the masks that we wear, right? This feigned individuality. So here it is. It is, as its name implies, only a mask of the collective psyche, a mask that feigns individuality, making others and oneself believe that one is individual, whereas one is simply acting a role through which the collective psyche speaks. Right? We're fooling ourselves. So let's look at the second passage on what the persona is before we wrap up the first half. Fundamentally, the persona is nothing real. It is a compromise between individual and society as to what a man should appear to be. He takes a name, earns a title, exercises a function. He is this or that. But for Jung, ultimately, this individuality, this persona is just a mask. We really need to take that off, reflect, and realize that we're much more part of the collective than we think we are, especially the collective unconscious at work inside of us. So for now, first half of this essay, hope that helps.